Welcome to the first episode of Minds Between Languages. Today we will talk about the origins of cognitive translation studies and then focus on keylogging as a tool to infer mental activity during translation. Our guest will be Professor Arnt Jakobsen, a leading cognitive translation scholar and the creator of the most widely used keylogging software in the field, Translog. Alright, well Arnt, thank you very much for joining this very first episode of Minds Between Languages, an inner look into translation and interpreting. It is really a treat to have you here. And before we start with the questions that we have prepared for today, I wanted to comment on a little anecdote. I don't know if you're aware of it, but you are pretty much regarded as the grandfather of translation process research, by the words of many colleagues that I have talked to at conferences and symposia and things like that. Are you aware of this grandfatherly role that you have, and how do you feel about it?
I feel very much like a grandfather. I have 6 grandchildren, and I have the age to be even older than most grandfathers. So it makes me very happy to know that this is how I'm regarded in the field. And when I think back to when all of this started back in the 90s, as far as I'm concerned, that makes me into a real grandfather.
Fantastic. And now moving on to the first part of the interview, and again, drawing on this grandfatherly role that you have, what would you say cognitive translation and interpreting studies is? A discipline that is also known as translation process research, and that can also be found by other names, but basically research on the cognitive aspects of translation and interpreting. What is this field all about?
I think I would make a distinction between some of those terms. It's true that there are many terms. As I remember it, we started using translation process research in the CRIT Center. And that was in connection with when we were offering summer schools for PhD students. And also because we felt we had developed a methodology that would appropriately be labeled research. So rather than studies, which we saw as a vaguer, we wanted to indicate that we were working in a lab, we were learning from psycholinguistics, that we had a methodology involving the use of computers and advanced technology like eye trackers later. So that's why we thought of labeling our work TPR, translation process research. I think of that as something of the past now, more or less. Obviously, there was a shift before we started looking into translation processes, and that has a long history, going back to the 1980s, when personally I'd just come out of a big project where we were studying text, and I was fed up with that. And what was on offer at the time, of course, was think aloud methodology. If you were interested in studying writing, in studying reading, and I had studied a bit of programming in the 80s, and I thought then later that we could do this much more accurately, and maybe we could somehow get information about what was going on in the human brain and the human mind, that we could get access to information about that from other sources than language, because this was how translation had been studied until then, through language, through linguistic representation. And I had been struck by a number of anomalies and asymmetries between how I felt mental processes were going on, and this linearization in language that I thought was not really very indicative of how cognitive processes unfolded. So that's why, to anticipate one of your questions, since I understand that we're going to focus on keylogging here, I thought of this Translog program in 1995, which of course had the advantage of adding accuracy to the time measurement. So suddenly we had millisecond accuracy, and we could study not only long pauses, but micro pauses.
But before moving on to the details of keylogging, this wonderful software that you came up with, so I want to have a broader picture of the field before we move on to the details of that method. So let's say for the newcomer's sake, it would be fair, tell me if you agree with this, say that translation process research is a field, an interdisciplinary field that is concerned with understanding what's going on inside the mind of people who engage in translation in any of its guises, let's say. Would that be a fair description, a general description of the field that you would agree with, Arnt?
I would agree with that description. And that was the aim, but it was a very vague aim, I thought, at the beginning. And that's where the distinction comes in that I would make between TPR and cognitive translation studies, or cognitive translation and interpreting studies. And so basically, cognitive translation studies, I think, is driven much more by theory, by an attempt to understand how we make meaning and how we represent meaning. And to me, that is really the crux of translation. That translation is all about making meaning from symbolic representations mainly, and representing meaning symbolically. This is what I find really fascinating and mind-blowing, almost mind-opening, certainly, with this cognitive orientation that and what makes translation such a fascinating discipline also, because it opens your mind to so many different ways of experiencing this wonderful world that we're in. And it almost generates a kind of ethical emotion in you that you want to try and appreciate different ways of, or you want to try and certainly be open to that kind of experience.
Now, you were mentioning that before TPR, there were other, let's say, cognitively oriented trends within the broad field of translation studies. And even before that, there were many other perspectives and approaches to translation. I mean, beyond cognitive interests themselves, right? I'm thinking about philosophical approaches to translation, textual approaches, structuralist approaches, functionalist approaches, and so on and so forth. So my question is, thinking about the broader, or the broadest, if you will, field of translation studies or translation and interpreting studies, what do cognitive approaches, and TPR in particular, bring to the picture? How do they enrich or extend or expand upon what is or have been achieved by other non-cognitive approaches? And why is it even worth thinking about translation and interpreting, if you will, in cognitive terms? Why not just stick to the usual approaches rooted in comparative linguistics or philosophy or structural descriptions and things like that?
Well, all of those approaches, I suppose, have their own ecology in a way, and they have their own social meaningfulness also. If you are a German functionalist, for instance, you are interested in social pragmatics, for instance. So how translation conveys meaning in social environments in particular. And of course, philosophically, I think translation opens up all of the really tricky questions about epistemology and how do we know anything, how certain knowledge can we have. So translation has always been, I think, attractive to people with a philosophical mind. What does cognitive translation studies then add? I think the key difference there is that it challenges a linguistic, or all of the linguistic approaches that we've had to translation, including maybe the functional, though I think cognitive translation studies embraces a lot of functional dimensions also. The fundamental thing is that it questions meaning, how we create meaning out of perception, from sense experience and perception. And that to me is what the cognitive dimension adds. And then of course we speculate also on whether there is a correlation, and this of course is where you're the expert, a correlation between what happens in the mind and what happens in the brain. And there we're confronting a giant ecosystem, the way I see it now. That is another cosmos that we're looking into.
So you said that the cognitive approach challenges some of the assumptions and the hypotheses and the claims that have been set forth by strictly linguistic approaches to translation. By saying that this approach challenges those linguistic conceptions, let's say, would you say that cognitive translation studies, or TPR, is in a way incompatible with or at odds with linguistic approaches? Or do you think more of a continuity, or perhaps even a synergistic relation between the cognitive and the non-cognitive linguistic trends in the field?
I think cognition and language are perhaps inextricably interwoven. So there's certainly no easy transition from one to the other. And one is deeply influenced by the other. And teasing them apart is really very difficult. I grew up in an area where the dialect the local dialect is quite different from standard Danish, to the extent that definiteness is indicated enclitically in one, and with an article in the dialect. And the mind doesn't care. The mind easily constructs definiteness or indefinite. It doesn't matter whether it is linearized, as I said earlier, in one way or the other. But why is this? So there is this asymmetry, it seems to me, between how the mind constructs meaning and how meaning is represented in language, where it obviously has to be linearized, both in speech and in writing, in a way that seems, you said contradict, but I don't know if it contradicts the way, but it's certainly not easily compatible with the way the mind seems to work to me.
I see. And now moving on to the particular approach that you pioneer to explore those fascinating mental processes during the act of translation. If we go back in time, and you were already making reference to this, people have been interested in what's going on in your mind when you translate, for many decades. And they have been relying on different tools. Some people would just take a look at translated texts, at the product of the translation process. and they would make inferences about what have been going on mentally in the generation of those texts. Some other people have been looking at introspection with think aloud protocols, in a way, having translators engage in metacognitive tasks so that they would be able to tell you what they were thinking about as they were making choices in the translation process. And there were other approaches. Now, at some point in time, you Arnt came up with the very intriguing notion that perhaps you could infer mental processes during translation through your fingers, if I may allow to put it that way. This was achieved through keylogging or keystroke logging. Could you please explain what keylogging is, how it works, and how you came up with that idea for people who may have not heard about this technology, this approach before?
The way keylogging is done is extremely simple. You ask what key was struck at what time. For each action, each keystroke, you can then measure the interval at millisecond precision between one and the next. So you get a timed profile of the action of typing a translation.
And just to clarify, this can be done on a regular laptop or a regular computer. It's just the run-of-the-mill keyboard that anybody uses in their actual ecological translation work, right?
Absolutely, and it was not a very complicated. It did some, in the first version, it did some analysis also, but the method of keylogging has been implemented in a lot of programs actually now, in a lot of eye tracking software and so on. It's standard. So you get a timestamp for each event, each Microsoft event, if you like, or each computer event that is recorded. So this is standard now, but it wasn't then. So I designed a program that my son programmed for me, because he was already at 15 years, he was already a better programmer than me. The program itself was not terribly complicated, but it did some replay, for instance, which was also new. And that turned out to be something that students really liked. They thought that if they could see a replay, a timed replay, like a video of their own writing process, there was learning, there was observational learning, as we would say now, in it, which they immediately recognized. So that was an application I hadn't thought of when I designed it, because I really only wanted it for my own research. And the reason for that was that I felt it was very difficult to work with verbal data from think aloud sessions. And I was, in the end, I felt I was not able to feel comfortably that I could distinguish between what sounded like explanations and what should be treated according to the theory as verbal data. So I wrote this article for a volume called Triangulating Translation that Fabio Alves edited. And triangulation, the way we were using it then, was triangulating verbal data experiments and the information that we could derive from verbal data, verbal accounts, verbal reports, and what I was claiming that the keystroke data indicated.
As you were saying, the technology that you devised allows to put a timestamp on each keyboard action. So when you press a key, a letter on the keyboard, a number on the keyboard, space bar, whatever, that is timed. And there's a whole bunch of other information. Now, my question would be, Arnt, how do you go from a number, which is basically the time, that it took someone to press one key, and then the time that it took someone to press another key, and then that succession of numbers, of time values, right, which is what you have. How do you go from that to understanding something about what was going on inside that person's mind? What do these numbers, these time values, indicate about actual mental or cognitive processes?
Well, yeah, I was waiting for the word processes to for you to mention that, because obviously what goes on in terms of mental pictures or content and so on, we don't really know. And we were not too interested in that. We were interested in pauses, in delays, in what appeared to be difficult and therefore cognitively challenging, more effortful, and we were using words like that to indicate the amount of mental work that we thought was being invested at any one point in time. And we've been criticized a lot for that, obviously, forgetting about what a translation was all about, people would say. But we were interested in cognitive load, and also in the difference between doing translation and writing a text, for instance. So we would be looking at, and others working in the same methodology have been doing this much better than I ever did, but looking into the difference between writing a translation, typing a translation, and typing just a narrative in your first language. And what I found very interesting is that it seems beyond doubt that there is a delay, there is an added delay when you're working with two languages that are active in your mind. So you can see this at all language levels, even between individual keystrokes in a word, between morphemes, between words, between phrases, between clauses. And then you get to a level where the planning that you need, if you're writing in a narrative in your own language, for instance, you need to plan ahead, and the planning takes time, and therefore, and this you don't need if you're translating, because the planning has been done by the original author. So there the curves break. But this is fascinating, that between any two languages, or across any two languages, there will be this delay. So there is an added effort that I think can only be attributed to the fact that a mind is managing two languages at the same time.
Now, moving beyond that overarching finding, this approach, the keylogging method, has been used to explore many other topics, let's say. Now, could you walk us through, perhaps in a very summary way, the main findings that have emerged based from the keylogging approach?
Looking at keylogging only, I would say that the first discovery that we were able to illustrate very graphically was that there seems to be three clearly definable and different phases. So there's an initial orientation phase, which in the keylogging method was identified by nothing, you might say. So there was one long pause where nothing was typed, typically. So we defined that arbitrarily, you might say, and by reference to the recording method only, as an introductory orientation, because we were assuming that there could be no typing unless there was some kind of comprehension that preceded the typing. So that would be the initial orientation, and we defined it.
Allow me to understand this correctly. So you start running the keylogging program. You present the
then we display the text.
with the text, and you see that for a certain amount of time, there are no keyboard actions. So you assume that they are doing something, but it's not typing. So that is what you define as orientation. Am I getting this right?
There was no keyboard activity except sometimes an arrow up or down or right and left a little bit, but no typing of any text. So that was the initial orientation. Then you got into the longest phase normally, which was the drafting phase, when you saw text being written and edited online. So what we found typically was that often you would get a first translation suggestion, a solution, which would very quickly be edited and deleted or changed into something better, maybe 3 or 4 times even. So there was this online processing going on. And then we defined the drafting phase as going all the way until the final full stop was typed. And then you could see very visually and very graphically. It was in that representation that you could very clearly see how the behavior was totally different in the revision, the final revision phase, we call it. So that was one major discovery. Well, I don't know, people had, many people before that had obviously talked of 3 phases or using similar labels, but we were able to pinpoint this very exactly and illustrating it also graphically with some precision. So that was one thing I felt that we identified. But what we also found very clearly was that production takes place in what we call chunks, but what is mainly called bursts now. And you have these bursts of creation, creating what we called a cognitive rhythm at the time. So we were surmising that these bursts or chunks related to some kind of holistic, meaning being represented in linear form in the typing.
And not only that, I mean, you were able to quantify that, right? I mean, to have actual quantitative information that could then be subjected to statistical analysis, which was, again, one of the a major turning point for, I mean, vis-a-vis previous approaches, which were preeminently, if not exclusively, qualitative and impressionistic in essence. Is this the case, Arnt?
That's true also. One thing, when we first presented these results, we were always told that, this is unreliable because people type at different speeds. But of course, this is something that we corrected for and is easily corrected for. So we had warming up exercises and we could see what their typing speed and also ability was, so we could correct for that. And the difference in typing speed was minimal in comparison with the rhythmical regularities and irregularities, the delays in front of certain rich places in the text, or whatever you call them, metaphorical expressions, challenges, deriving from asymmetries between the semantics of the languages, and so on. So they came across very clearly. So that was certainly also something that we were able to show. We were also able to demonstrate a correlation between competence, you might say, novices, the behavior of novices and professionals, or sometimes we call them experts. We were not too specific, and we were not at that time too much into expertise theory, but levels of performance could be diagnosed by simply looking at the the overall speed
Right.
with which a translation was made and the size of the chunks.
Right, right. So there was a lot that could be done, and that is still being done with this idea, which now in retrospect sounds even very simple. I mean, the fact that you could quantify the time it takes a person to press each key as he or she is producing a translation. But what are the limitations of the keylogging approach? Which are the things that it cannot do, and that perhaps you would wish it were able to do, or that perhaps might be able to be approachable with further developments in the future?
Well, the obvious limitation is that you cannot really know what's going on cognitively in a pause. Because we could surmise that a pause could be generated by a planning, forward planning activity that was going on. It could be generated by a translation difficulty, by a comprehension difficulty, by a production difficulty. It could be generated also perhaps by some monitoring activity, that something was being reread or reconsidered, and there was no way that we could really tell. I've written many times that the problem with keylogging is that it comes at the tail end of the process, that so much goes on before you actually get to the typing, that you can only guess about.
Right. I mean, this is also where theory has a major role to play, because at some point you need some theoretical notions to be able to constrain those values, those numbers that you're seeing in the keylogging log.
Data is only meaningful when you have an idea of how to interpret the data.
Right.
So that was brought home to us very clearly, that there was no easy way from the data to a ready-made analysis that would be meaningful about mental processes.
And we are pretty much aware of the major impact that this whole approach and its ramifications have had within the translation process research community. But what is your take on the impact that these discoveries have had on non-cognitive approaches to translation studies?
Yeah, I mentioned this idea of observational learning, and I think this is one area, not just for teaching translation, but for teaching writing, where it has had a certain impact, not a huge impact. And originally we created, with the old version, we created a forum where users could interact and support each other's projects. But with Translog 2, that is no longer the case, so we don't really know the impact and how it's being used and for what purposes. But I would say that maybe pedagogically, it's been going beyond translation research, certainly into writing in particular, but also as a component in pedagogical studies of what makes students interested in their own learning process, for instance.
It's very nice to see that a development that was pretty much rooted in epistemological or methodological concerns at the very beginning then has implications and ramifications that go beyond what you had anticipated at first. I mean, I think that's a very, very nice symptom. And you were mentioning, Arnt, that, well, you were pretty much there at the very beginning of TPR and becoming aware of the limitations of purely impressionistic approaches. You are now a leading figure of the field at present. And with that, with the benefit of hindsight, retrospection, with the benefit of all the information and the experience that you have in the here and now, I would like to ask you about the future of the field. Where do you see translation process research or cognitive translation and interpreting studies moving in the future?
Well, for me personally, where I think I would like to see cognitive translation studies going rather than translation process research, which I still associate quite narrowly with keylogging and eye tracking and maybe some think aloud, which, by the way, I return to again and again, because as you said earlier, I think the best way of getting knowledge out of people's heads is by asking them to tell me about what goes on in their heads. But from the point of view of translation, I think the next question then is, how does meaning that we construct gets to be represented? And this opens up a huge world of wonderful creativity for me, because if the meaning that we are translating, that if what we translate is meaning, and to me, that's what translation is all about, then it opens up a world of creativity and creative options for the translator. So yeah, if we could devise some way of exploring better the relationship between, let's say, experience, or we can even say reality. So there's the big reality there, and meaning and language, those three. So it's a little bit like Sapir and Worf and all of that. We want that triad somehow to be explored better. What is the relationship between those three big items? So that's where I would like to see cognitive translation studies going. But there is something that we have not touched upon at all. It just strikes me now, which is the computational theory of mind and everything that is going on in computation, computational models of mind. And of course, computers are doing wonderful work that is called translation, but is still 100% based on linguistic representation, as far as I know. Mm-hmm. And there is a very big challenge there, where people working in cognition, cognitive translation studies, should be talking to people who develop computational solutions, machine translation systems, because for machine translation systems to take the next step, they will have to learn about emotions. They will have to learn about experience. They will have to know about how humans experience the world in order to be able to simulate the kind of forces that shape and what's the word? Sculpt is the word that is sometimes used, that sculpt our experience and shape our translations. So that would be another interesting area for a combination of cognitive translation studies and machine translation to be moving.
Definitely. And to conclude here, we have the hope that this video series that we are inaugurating with you, Arnt, and thanks again for that, will reach not only people who are already part of the cognitive translation and interpreting studies world, or the TPR realm, but also by people from outside the field. And let's say that there's someone who's not part of the field, who has never thought about translation and interpreting in cognitive terms, or that maybe we're someone who has only played around with that idea. And let's assume that that person wants to venture into the field, perhaps do a master's or a PhD or become a full-blown researcher in this arena, what would be your recommendation, your advice for that person? Any tips that you would have for young scholars aspiring to become part of this world?
I wouldn't know what to say there, because you've really got to be interested. You've got to be interested in languages. You've got to be interested in people. You've got to be interested in the mind, which I think is the most wonderful thing there is. But you've also, potentially, you've got to be interested in everything that there is in human experience. So don't do it for the money. Do it because you get into a wonderfully creative world full of exciting experience.
Thank you very much for your time, for agreeing to being part of this first episode, and for your knowledge, your ideas, and for everything that you've done for the field, Arnt. Really, that enthusiasm you were just mentioning is certainly reverberated, and it still does throughout the field.
It's been my pleasure.